They say some men are born into trouble, while others go looking for it. But in the case of George Kelly Barnes, the man the world would later call Machine Gun Kelly, trouble seemed to find him no matter which road he took. His story begins far from the smoke-filled backrooms of gangland deals or the echoing gunfire of FBI raids. It starts in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1895 under the southern sun, where a restless young boy dreamed of something bigger than the ordinary life that stretched before him. George was born into a decent, middle-class family, nothing spectacular, nothing destitute. His father was a businessman, stern and practical, while his mother was protective, always hoping her son would find purpose. But young George had the kind of spirit that didn't sit still. He was curious, reckless, and just a bit too fascinated by the things he wasn't supposed to touch. Even as a boy, he seemed drawn to the edges of respectability, the shimmer of excitement that lived beyond the rules. He wasn't a bad kid, not at first. He went to school, made friends, cracked jokes, and charmed his way out of trouble more times than his teachers could count. But behind that charm was an unquiet hunger, a craving for recognition, adventure, and danger. The early 1900s were changing times in America. The streets buzzed with opportunity, bootleggers whispered promises of easy money, and prohibition was turning law-abiding citizens into outlaws overnight. The line between hero and criminal was thin, and George would soon find himself stepping right across it. After high school, George enrolled at Mississippi A&M, hoping to carve out a decent life. But college didn't suit him. The lectures, the rules, the endless talk of discipline, it all felt suffocating. He dropped out and began drifting, taking odd jobs that barely paid the rent. The country was restless after World War I, and so was he. America was roaring into a new age, and George wanted his piece of the noise. He married young, too young perhaps. His first marriage fell apart before it had time to bloom. Restlessness, bad company, and the lure of fast money led him astray. He found work running liquor during Prohibition, hauling illegal booze through the dusty back roads of the South. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid, and for a man like George, it felt like a calling. There was danger, risk, and most importantly, respect, or at least the kind that comes from the wrong kind of men. Bootlegging was a dirty, thrilling game. You had to be quick, clever, and fearless. George had all three qualities, but he lacked direction. He worked for others, doing the hard jobs and taking the bigger risks. And every night, when the money came in and the liquor flowed, he'd sit back and imagine something greater. He wanted to be known. He wanted a name that carried weight in the underworld. But for now, he was just George Barnes, a small-time hustler trying to outdrive the law. That all began to change when he got his hands on something that would define him forever: a Thompson submachine gun. The Tommy gun, as it was called, was the symbol of the age. A sleek, deadly invention that spat bullets faster than most men could think. When George picked it up for the first time, it was like destiny had found him. The feel of it, the roar, the power, it was intoxicating. It wasn't long before his associates started calling him Machine Gun Kelly. At first, he laughed it off. It was a nickname meant for fun, a half-joke tossed around by drinking buddies. But soon the name took on a life of its own. People began whispering it in bars, cops started writing it in reports, and the underworld began to take notice. Kelly, this smooth-talking Southerner with a knack for trouble, was becoming a legend before he'd even done anything to deserve it. But legends, like fire, grow faster when fed by the wrong kind of fuel. And for George, that fuel came in the form of a woman named Catherine Thorne. She was sharp, ambitious, and dangerous in her own right. A woman who saw in George not just a man, but a brand. Catherine encouraged him to lean into the persona, to act the part of the big-time gangster she believed he could be. She bought him flashy suits, told him to pose with his Tommy gun, and introduced him to people who could open darker doors. Together, they became something of a Bonnie and Clyde duo, though their crimes would cut deeper and echo louder. But before the legend fully bloomed, before the world knew his name, George was still struggling between two lives, the one he was born into, and the one calling his name from the shadows. He'd always wanted to be someone important, but he hadn't yet realized that fame and infamy often wore the same face. By the late 1920s, America was drowning in corruption and chaos. Prohibition had turned the country into a giant criminal enterprise. The streets of Chicago, Kansas City, and Dallas pulsed with illegal money. Men like Al Capone ruled with iron fists, while others, hungry and reckless, fought to carve out their own piece of the pie. George saw the opportunity, and with Catherine whispering in his ear, he decided it was time to stop being a small-time player. Still, there was something almost tragic about him then, a man who didn't fully understand the beast he was feeding. He wasn't naturally cruel or violent. He was more of a showman than a killer. He loved the image, the fame, the way people's eyes widened when they heard his name. It made him feel alive, invincible even. But the world of organized crime doesn't forgive vanity. And as George was about to learn, every moment of glory comes with a countdown ticking quietly in the background. Some nights, he'd sit in a dimly lit bar, the cigarette smoke curling around his face, listening to jazz bands play while his mind wandered. Maybe, deep down, he knew he was already on a road with no way back. Maybe he liked it that way. In those moments, when the laughter faded and the music slowed, he'd catch glimpses of the boy he once was, the kid from Memphis who just wanted to be somebody. But that boy was long gone, buried beneath the swagger and the gun smoke. The early days of Machine Gun Kelly weren't about crime. They were about identity. Every heist, every bottle of bootleg liquor, every boastful word was part of his transformation. He was building an image piece by piece, and soon that image would swallow him whole. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of something enormous. The newspapers would one day scream his name. The FBI would chase him across state lines, and his story would become part of the mythos of American crime. But in this moment, in the calm before the storm, he was just George Barnes, sitting in a smoky bar with a gun under his coat and a dream in his chest. The world outside was roaring, drunk on jazz, whiskey, and rebellion. And somewhere deep inside him, the spark that would ignite his rise was flickering to life. He would soon become one of the most infamous men in America. Not because he was the most dangerous, but because he believed in the performance of danger. The machine gun was just a prop. The real weapon was his own hunger for recognition. And once that hunger took over, there was no stopping the man behind the myth. The boy from Memphis was gone. Machine Gun Kelly had been born. The transformation from George Kelly Barnes to Machine Gun Kelly didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, a steady climb from the back alleys of bootlegging to the front pages of America's newspapers. By the early 1930s, the man once known for running whiskey across state lines had evolved into something larger, something magnetic. He had swagger now, confidence, and a dangerous kind of charm that could pull a crowd in even when every instinct told them to run the other way. It was Catherine who fanned that flame. She wasn't just his wife, she was his architect. She saw potential in George, the same way a showman sees potential in a rough diamond that just needs polishing. Catherine had a gift for reading people, for knowing how to make them believe a story. And the story she wanted the world to believe was that Machine Gun Kelly was untouchable. She pushed him to lean into the persona, to live it, breathe it, perform it. She bought him tailored suits, had him photographed with his weapon, and whispered in his ear that he was destined to rule the underworld. But behind all the glamour, George was still a man trying to figure out who he really was. The more he played the role, the harder it became to tell where George ended and Machine Gun Kelly began. He wasn't as cold-blooded as his name suggested, but the reputation was too valuable to throw away. In the world of organized crime, fear was currency, and Kelly had it in spades. He began working jobs that were bolder, more reckless: bank robberies, armed heists, smuggling operations that stretched across multiple states. The Great Depression had left millions desperate, and crime was booming. Banks were symbols of greed, and robbing them made men like Kelly look like twisted versions of heroes. But to the law, he was just another outlaw, another name to add to the growing list of America's public enemies. The first big score came in 1930. It wasn't perfect, few of them were, but it proved something to Kelly. He could handle the heat. He planned meticulously, acted with flair, and always made sure to leave a mark that screamed, "Machine Gun Kelly was here." It wasn't enough to rob a place. He wanted the world to know he'd done it. That hunger for notoriety was both his fuel and his poison. Catherine loved it. She loved the luxury, the excitement, the danger. She loved being the wife of a man who made headlines. In her mind, they were America's new power couple, criminal royalty. She bragged about him, sometimes even to strangers, letting his legend grow like wildfire. And soon, the newspapers took the bait. Stories of a smooth-talking, machine-gun-wielding outlaw began to sweep the country. Reporters described him as ruthless, fearless, and clever, a criminal mastermind who could outthink the law. The truth was messier. George wasn't as sharp as the papers claimed. He wasn't stupid, but he lacked the cold precision of men like Capone or Lansky. He was more impulsive, more emotional. He wanted the fame, the thrill, the attention, and that made him sloppy. Catherine didn't mind. As long as the headlines kept coming, she didn't care if half the stories were exaggerated. The myth was what mattered. Then came the moment that would cement his place in history, the event that turned him from a regional crook into a national obsession. In 1933, George "Machine Gun" Kelly and his crew kidnapped Charles F. Urschel, a wealthy oilman from Oklahoma City. It was one of the most daring crimes of its time, a high-stakes abduction carried out in the dead of night, with precision and nerve. Urschel was dragged from his home at gunpoint, blindfolded, and taken to a remote farmhouse while Kelly and his men demanded a ransom of $200,000, a staggering sum in those days. It was the perfect crime, or at least it was supposed to be. Kelly and Catherine had planned it for weeks. Every detail was mapped out, the location, the hiding spot, the ransom drop. But what they hadn't counted on was Urschel's sharp memory and iron will. Even while blindfolded, the oilman memorized every sound, every smell, every small clue that could later identify his captors. He was calm, methodical, and smarter than Kelly expected. The ransom was paid, and Urschel was released unharmed, something that would later work against Kelly in court. But by then, the FBI was already on the trail. The Bureau, still relatively young at the time, was desperate to prove itself. The Urschel case was a golden opportunity to show America that no outlaw, no matter how famous, could escape federal justice. Meanwhile, Kelly reveled in his newfound fame. The newspapers were calling him the most dangerous man in America. His name was on every radio broadcast, every headline, every wanted poster. He was living the dream, or at least the twisted version of it he and Catherine had built. They moved between safe houses, spending money as fast as they could make it, partying, boasting, and pretending the law couldn't touch them. But the cracks were beginning to show. The more famous Kelly became, the more eyes were on him. Associates started to turn nervous. The FBI was closing in, tracing the ransom money through marked bills. The image of the invincible Machine Gun Kelly was starting to look like a mask slipping off a tired, desperate man, still in those final months before his empire began to crumble. Kelly lived like he was invincible. He'd walk into bars, order drinks for everyone, and talk big about the jobs he'd pulled. Some said he'd brag about his crimes to anyone who'd listen. Others claimed he'd laugh at the FBI, saying they didn't have the guts or brains to catch him. The truth was he believed his own legend, and that's what made him dangerous. Catherine kept feeding that illusion. She'd tell him he was too smart to get caught, too famous to fall. She'd smooth his ego when doubts crept in, reminding him that the world saw him as a gangster king. But deep down, George was starting to feel the weight of it all. Every sound outside the window, every unfamiliar car that drove by, it all set him on edge. He'd built a life on fear, and now that same fear was turning back on him. In the underworld, the rise always feels faster than the fall. And for Machine Gun Kelly, the climb to the top had been blinding. He had money, power, and a reputation that stretched from coast to coast. But like every man who flies too close to the sun, he was about to learn that fame in the criminal world burns fast, and it burns out even faster. Still, in those fleeting moments of triumph, he didn't see the end coming. He saw only the spotlight, the flash of cameras, and the echo of his own name bouncing through history. He had become what he always wanted to be, a legend. The problem was, legends have a way of outliving the men who create them. By the summer of 1933, the name Machine Gun Kelly had become a storm that swept across the headlines of America. It wasn't just the newspapers talking anymore. It was the public, the police, the underworld, and even small-town folks who'd never set foot near a city. Everyone had an opinion about him. Some saw him as a dangerous outlaw, others as a folk hero, sticking it to the system. Either way, George Kelly Barnes had achieved what he'd always wanted. The world finally knew his name. At the height of his infamy, Kelly lived like a man who believed his own mythology. He wore fine suits, smoked expensive cigars, and carried himself with a swagger that bordered on theatrical. He was a man who had clawed his way out of obscurity, trading his ordinary past for a life of criminal glamour. But beneath the shine and noise, something darker pulsed, a quiet, gnawing paranoia that whispered to him when the night grew still. The ransom from the Urschel kidnapping had made him rich, but it also made him a marked man. The FBI, led by the ambitious J. Edgar Hoover, was turning the full force of its growing power toward capturing him. Hoover saw Kelly not just as a criminal, but as a symbol, a chance to show the American people that the Bureau could strike fear into the heart of organized crime. Kelly's name became the headline weapon in Hoover's public crusade against the gangsters of the Depression era. Meanwhile, George and Catherine moved like ghosts, never staying in one place long enough for comfort. They drifted through the South and Midwest, changing names, renting safe houses, and pretending not to feel the walls closing in. For all their talk of power, they were running, hunted by a system that was learning how to hunt better than ever before. Yet, in public, Kelly kept up appearances. He played the role of the unflinching gangster king, laughing loudly in bars, tossing money to musicians, and showing off his Tommy gun as if it were a badge of honor. He was addicted to the image, even as it was slowly destroying him. Catherine, ever the manipulator, pushed him to stay in character. "The world believes in Machine Gun Kelly," she'd tell him, "and so should you. But fame in the underworld is a double-edged blade. The same people who feared him also envied him, and envy breeds betrayal." Former associates began talking to the feds. Others turned on him out of fear. The marked bills from the ransom were showing up in cities across the country, each one a breadcrumb leading the FBI closer. Still, Kelly clung to his legend. He bragged about his exploits, sometimes even to strangers who recognized him. He carried his machine gun everywhere, posing for photographs and basking in the persona he'd built. He was no longer just a man. He was a character in a story too big to control. During these months, the Kellys hid in a farmhouse near Memphis, the same city where George's story had begun. It was a cruel kind of irony, returning to his roots just as everything was starting to fall apart. The farm belonged to a couple of small-time criminals who offered them refuge in exchange for money. The air was thick with summer heat and tension. The fields were quiet, but George couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from beyond the trees. Every night, as he sat by the window, cigarette smoke curling through the dark, he'd think about how far he'd come and how little peace it had bought him. He'd wanted respect, fame, and power. Now he had them all, and yet he couldn't sleep without his gun within reach. Somewhere out there, he knew the FBI was closing in, led by agents who were patient, precise, and relentless. Meanwhile, Catherine never lost her taste for the spotlight. She'd talk about what they'd do next, how they'd leave the country, maybe head to Mexico, live like royalty. George wanted to believe her, but the dream was cracking. The money was running low, the gang was falling apart, and his nerves were fraying with every sunrise. The man who once strutted into speakeasies like he owned the world now jumped at the sound of barking dogs in the distance. As summer turned to fall, Hoover's agents tracked them to Memphis. They had gathered evidence, informants, and enough leads to surround the farmhouse. The end wasn't going to be a cinematic shootout. It was going to be a slow, humiliating capture. The Bureau wanted Kelly alive. They wanted the headlines. The raid came before dawn on September 26, 1933. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of dew and fear. Federal agents crept quietly through the grass, surrounding the house with rifles drawn. Inside, Kelly stirred awake to the sound of distant footsteps. For a moment, he thought it was another dream. Then the shouting began. "FBI, come out with your hands up." Panic spread through the house like wildfire. Catherine screamed. George stumbled to his feet, reaching for the Thompson gun that had given him his name. But the myth of Machine Gun Kelly, fearless, unbreakable, unstoppable, collapsed in that moment. The real man, George Barnes, stood trembling in his underwear, realizing that the story was over. Outside, floodlights blazed through the windows, blinding and merciless. The agents shouted again. "Come out, Kelly! We've got you surrounded." And then came the words that would haunt him forever. Words shouted in desperation, words that the FBI would turn into legend. "Don't shoot, G-men! Don't shoot!" With those words, the mighty Machine Gun Kelly surrendered. No bullets, no bloodshed, no final stand. Just the sound of boots on the porch, handcuffs clinking, and the fall of a man who'd believed too much in his own myth. Catherine was arrested beside him, still trying to talk her way out, still clinging to the illusion of control. But it was over. The headlines that had once celebrated their exploits now screamed of their capture. The legend had been broken, and Hoover's FBI had its trophy. In the weeks that followed, America couldn't get enough of the story. Newspapers printed every detail of the arrest, from the raid to the famous surrender line. Some even claimed Kelly had begged for mercy, though witnesses later disagreed. It didn't matter. The image was too powerful, the once great gangster brought to his knees by the men he'd mocked. The trial that followed was a spectacle. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, photographers, and curious citizens. The prosecution painted Kelly as a cold-blooded mastermind, the ultimate symbol of organized crime. The defense tried to argue that Catherine had been the true brains behind the operation. But the jury didn't care about nuance. They cared about making an example. When the verdict came down, it was swift and final: life in prison. Machine Gun Kelly was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock, where America sent the men it couldn't trust anywhere else. For all his bravado, George was quiet when the sentence was read. The performance was over. The applause had stopped. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence, the kind that follows when the last bullet's been fired and the smoke clears. At his peak, Machine Gun Kelly had been a symbol of chaos, rebellion, and fame. But as he was led away in chains, he became something else entirely, a cautionary tale. Prison has a way of stripping men down to their truest selves. It takes away the noise, the fame, the illusions, and what's left is just a man, bare and ordinary, staring at the wreckage of his own making. For George Kelly Barnes, the walls of Alcatraz felt colder than any cell he'd ever imagined. Gone were the tailored suits, the smoky clubs, the flash of the Tommy gun in his hands. In their place were gray uniforms, steel bars, and the echo of footsteps that never stopped. When Kelly arrived at Alcatraz in 1934, the island prison was still new, an experiment in absolute control. It was built for men like him, gangsters, kidnappers, murderers, the so-called untouchables of the underworld. The guards didn't care about his reputation. To them, he wasn't Machine Gun Kelly, the infamous outlaw. He was inmate number 117, a man whose name had been traded for a number, his fame reduced to whispers in the yard. The first weeks were brutal. The isolation ate at him. There were no crowds to impress, no headlines to feed his ego. For the first time in his life, he was invisible. And yet even in the silence, his legend followed him like a ghost. Other inmates watched him with curiosity. Some admired him, others mocked him. They'd seen the newspapers, the stories about how he'd supposedly begged for mercy when the FBI surrounded his house. The words "Don't shoot, G-men" had become a national punchline, a symbol of cowardice in a world that worshipped defiance. Kelly hated that more than the cell itself, the idea that his legend had turned against him. He'd built his name on fear, and now it had become a joke. The other prisoners called him Pop Gun Kelly, whispering it just loud enough for him to hear. Each time they said it, it chipped away at what little pride he had left. At night, when the prison went quiet and the fog rolled in from the bay, he'd lie awake staring at the ceiling. The waves crashing against the rocks below sounded almost like applause, a cruel echo of the attention he'd once craved. But this time no one was clapping for him. The only audience he had now was the ghosts of his choices. He thought a lot about Catherine during those early years. She was locked up too, serving her own sentence. Part of him blamed her for everything, the fame, the kidnapping, the fall. But deep down, he knew the truth. Catherine hadn't made him a criminal. She'd just amplified what was already inside him. The hunger for attention, the need to be seen, the endless chase for something bigger than himself. That was all George. She'd simply shown him how to turn it into a show. Letters came occasionally, mostly from strangers, some curious, others hateful. A few came from people who still believed in the myth, fans who called him a legend, an anti-hero. He'd read them slowly, tracing the words like relics from another life. But the letters from Catherine were the hardest. She wrote with the same confidence as always, talking about how they'd be remembered, how history would vindicate them. George would read her words, then fold the paper neatly and set it aside, unable to reply. Somewhere between the cell walls and the silence, he'd stopped believing in legends. Over time, prison changed him. The swagger faded. The arrogance drained away. He became quieter, more reflective. He kept to himself, doing his work, reading what few books the library had to offer. Guards noted that he caused no trouble, that he was polite, almost too polite. Some of the younger inmates didn't recognize him at all. To them, he was just another aging convict with tired eyes, and yet, every so often, someone new would arrive and whisper, "That's Machine Gun Kelly," and for a fleeting second, George would feel the old spark, the recognition, the ghost of fame. But it never lasted. The name didn't carry the same weight anymore. The world outside had moved on. Gangsters were still being born, still dying, and the newspapers had new names to print. The man who had once commanded headlines was now forgotten by all but a few. Years passed like shadows, quiet and indistinguishable. Alcatraz had a way of swallowing time. Birthdays didn't matter. Seasons blurred. All that existed was routine. Wake up, count, eat, work, count again, sleep. Day after day, until time itself stopped feeling real. Sometimes, Kelly would sit by the small window in the cell, looking out toward the mainland. On clear days he could see the faint outline of San Francisco, so close yet impossibly far. It was a cruel view, a reminder of freedom just out of reach. He'd watch the fog roll in and wonder if anyone out there still said his name. The guards noticed his change. He wasn't the brash gangster they'd read about. He was humble, almost gentle. One officer later recalled that Kelly often helped other inmates read or write letters. He'd even tell stories from his past, though he left out the bravado. He spoke more like a man confessing to ghosts than a legend boasting about his glory days. It was in those moments that George began to see what his life had really been. Not a grand adventure, but a desperate search for meaning. He'd spent his youth chasing attention, mistaking fear for respect. Now, in the stillness of his cell, he understood the difference. The respect he'd always wanted couldn't be taken at gunpoint. By the 1940s, he was transferred out of Alcatraz to Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. He was older now, grayer and softer around the edges. The world outside had changed. The war, the new generation, the rise of different criminals. He was a relic of a bygone era, a name buried under the weight of time. At Leavenworth, he found something he hadn't expected: peace. He worked quietly in the prison factory, earning a modest reputation as a reliable, kind inmate. Guards described him as a model prisoner. He no longer talked about his past. He no longer had to. The legend of Machine Gun Kelly had burned out. But George Kelly Barnes, the man beneath the myth, was learning how to exist without it. He aged gracefully within the gray walls, his fame long forgotten by the outside world. Occasionally, journalists tried to track him down for interviews, but he declined. There was nothing left to say. The story had been written, and it no longer belonged to him. As the years wore on, his health began to fail. The once feared gangster who'd commanded men in headlines now walked slowly with a cane, his steps measured, his voice quiet. Fellow inmates said he often spent his evenings watching the sunset from the small yard, his face calm, almost content. It was as if the years of silence had washed away the noise of his former life. In 1954, at the age of 59, George Kelly Barnes, Machine Gun Kelly, died in prison from a heart attack. There was no fanfare, no headlines, no crowd to witness his final breath. Just the low hum of prison life carrying on as it always had. The man who had once held America's attention with the roar of his gun left the world as quietly as a whisper. For a moment, his death made the papers. A few brief articles, a handful of old photographs, a retelling of the crimes that made him infamous. Then, just like that, the world moved on again. But maybe that's how it was always meant to end, not with a blaze of gunfire, but with the silence of a man who finally understood the cost of his own legend. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest names, blurring the edges of fear until all that's left is a story, a cautionary tale whispered by history to those who dare to chase power without purpose. Machine Gun Kelly's name, once shouted across the front pages of America, now lingers in the quiet corners of criminal folklore. The roar of his Thompson gun has faded into myth, his picture yellowed in archives, his legend shrinking to fit inside a paragraph of forgotten history books. But legends like his never die completely. They change shape. They become mirrors, reflecting the times that birthed them and the people who made them famous. George Kelly Barnes had dreamed of greatness, but the kind he found came with a price he could never pay. He wasn't born cruel, nor was he born evil. He was born restless, a man who mistook noise for meaning, fame for worth. And in the roaring chaos of the Prohibition era, when men like Capone and Dillinger turned crime into theater, George found a stage big enough to hide behind. The irony, of course, was that the man behind the myth wasn't a hardened killer or a ruthless mastermind. He was a showman, a man who loved attention more than blood, who brandished his machine gun like a magician's wand. Even his famous nickname, Machine Gun Kelly, started as a joke between bootleggers. Yet that joke grew into a monster, and soon the world saw him as something he could no longer control. There's something almost tragic about that. He created a mask, so convincing that it consumed him completely. He wanted to be feared, admired, remembered. And in a way, he got all three. But what he never realized, what so many like him never do, is that fear fades, admiration twists into curiosity, and memory doesn't belong to the man who lived it. It belongs to the world that tells it. After his death, America moved on quickly. The 1950s brought a new kind of order, a new kind of criminal. The flamboyant, cigar-smoking gangsters of the Depression gave way to quieter men in suits, organized, calculated, hidden behind corporations and politics. The outlaw with a Tommy gun became a relic, a ghost from a louder, wilder time. Still, every so often, his name would resurface. A film, a book, a passing mention in a documentary about America's gangland past. And every time, his story would be told the same way: a rise, a fall, and a lesson. The boy from Memphis who wanted to be somebody, who built himself into a myth, and who learned, too late, that legends don't bleed, but men do. It's strange how the world remembers people like him. The newspapers that once cursed his name now treat him like folklore. The public that once feared him now consumes his story like entertainment. It's a pattern as old as crime itself. We fear the outlaw in the moment, then romanticize him when he's gone. Maybe it's because deep down we see a bit of ourselves in men like Kelly. The hunger for more, the need to matter, the temptation to take shortcuts when the world seems unfair. But the difference between a dreamer and a criminal lies in the choices they make. When the world says no, George didn't know how to stop chasing what he couldn't have. He didn't know how to live without applause. And so, when the spotlight faded, there was nothing left of him but silence. Those who knew him near the end said he became almost gentle, humble even. Gone was the cocky gangster who waved a Tommy gun in photographs. In his place stood a man who'd finally learned what peace felt like, though it came far too late. In letters he never sent, he reportedly wrote about regret, not for being caught, but for chasing an illusion. He'd built a life out of pretending, and the pretending had become reality until it was too late to turn back. If there's a moral to his story, it isn't about crime or punishment. It's about identity, about the danger of becoming the version of yourself that others expect to see. Kelly spent his life trying to live up to a legend that wasn't real, until the line between man and myth vanished entirely. Even his most famous moment, the surrender, the "don't shoot G-men," was both truth and distortion. Some say he shouted it in panic. Others claim it was invented by the FBI to make him look weak. But it didn't matter what the truth was. What mattered was the image. History remembered the words, not the man. That's the cruel poetry of fame. The truth doesn't survive, only the story does. Looking back now, it's easy to paint Kelly as a symbol of the old gangster era, a man caught between ambition and absurdity. But if you look closer, you see something more human. You see a man who wanted to escape mediocrity so badly that he built a castle out of smoke and mirrors. You see a man who thought that carrying a machine gun could fill the void that ordinary life couldn't. And in chasing that illusion, he became its prisoner long before the law ever found him. In the quiet years after his death, the people who still remembered him spoke of him not with fear, but with a strange kind of pity. Guards, inmates, and even agents described him as polite, soft-spoken, almost fragile. The public enemy label didn't seem to fit the man they'd met behind bars. Maybe that was his final punishment, not the prison walls or the loss of freedom, but the realization that his own legend had betrayed him. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who had used Kelly's arrest to build the FBI's reputation, moved on quickly to other victories. Kelly's capture had been one chapter in Hoover's long campaign to make federal law enforcement the face of justice in America. The man who had once symbolized the untouchable gangster became a footnote in the Bureau's success story. And yet, more than 90 years later, his name still lingers. Maybe not in fear, but in fascination. Because beneath the crime and the chaos, his story holds something timeless, a reflection of human weakness. The craving for validation, the belief that power can buy immortality, the tragic truth that attention fades faster than redemption. Machine gun. Kelly's life reminds us that fame without foundation is hollow. You can build your name out of fire and steel, but it will still burn out. And when the world forgets the noise, all that's left is the echo of who you really were. If George Kelly Barnes could speak now, perhaps he'd tell us that the real danger isn't in breaking the law, it's in losing yourself to the myth of who you think you should be. His rise and fall weren't just the story of one man. They were the reflection of an era, a time when desperation and opportunity collided, when America was caught between morality and chaos. Kelly was both product and victim of that world. And when the dust settled, his story became a warning written in gun smoke. No one outruns their own reflection. He wanted to be remembered. And in a way he was. Not for his crimes, not for his riches, but for the lesson his life left behind. That behind every myth is a man. Behind every gun is a trembling hand. And behind every rise and fall lies the same truth. That the louder you try to make the world hear your name, the faster it forgets the sound. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Stories of men who burned too bright, too fast, and learned too late that legends always come with a cost.